In the shadowed mists of the Scottish Highlands, a legend was about to be born. At the Battle of Dunbar in 1296, where Edward IV of England mercilessly crushed the Scottish army, there was more at play than the clashing of swords and shields. Among the Scottish ranks, a figure cloaked in mystery, known only as the Raven, fought with a ferocity and cunning that whispered of a deeper, unseen battle. As Edward IV claimed victory and enforced his rule over Scotland, this shadowy warrior's tale began to unfold, intertwining with the fates of famous names like William Wallace and King Edward himself. What secret did the Raven hold that could change the course of the war, and perhaps the very fabric of Scottish resistance? This is not just a story of battles and conquests, it's the untold saga of intrigue, betrayal, and a relentless quest for freedom. Dive into the heart of Scottish history, where every turn of the page reveals a new twist, and discover how the Raven became a symbol of a nation's unyielding spirit. Stay with us as we unravel a tale so gripping you won't be able to turn away until the very end. At the Battle of Dunbar in 1296, Edward I attacked Scotland and defeated the Scottish army. Edward was able to bring down Scotland and force King John Balliol to resign thanks to this victory. John de Warenne, Edward's personal governor, was thereafter chosen to lead Scotland. The Scottish people, however, were adamant about opposing English control. Scottish warrior William Wallace launched an uprising against the English in 1297. After Wallace's victory against the English at the Battle of Stirling Bridge, the Scottish people vowed to carry on their independence movement. The English and Scottish forces engaged in a significant battle on September 11, 1297, near Stirling Bridge. The First War of Scottish Independence saw a sea change in the outcome of the fight, which was successfully won by the English under the leadership of King Edward I. At the Battle of Dunbar in 1296, Edward I entered Scotland and defeated the Scottish army. Edward was able to take over Scotland and force King John Balliol to resign thanks to this victory. John de Warenne, Edward's personal governor, was afterwards chosen to take over Scotland. The Scottish people, however, were resolute about fighting English control. The Scottish hero William Wallace launched a revolution against the English in 1297. After Wallace's victory against the English at the Battle of Stirling Bridge, the Scottish people resolved to carry on their independence movement. The River Forth, near the town of Stirling, was the site of the Battle of Stirling Bridge. The English army under Edward I exceeded the Scottish force under Wallace. At Stirling Bridge, the English force crossed the River Forth. On the other side of the bridge, though, was the Scottish army, waiting for them. By positioning themselves on the small bridge, the Scots made it harder for the English force to launch an attack. The Scots showered the English troops with arrows as they attacked across the bridge. The English soldiers were trapped in the river when the bridge gave way beneath their weight. Edward and his soldiers got stuck in the river. His army was in disarray, and the Scots had surrounded him. Edward III was a formidable fighter, though. His forces rallied, and they attacked. The fight went on for hours. At last, the English managed to breach the Scottish defense. Edward I triumphed after the Scots were routed. The English won a significant victory at the Battle of Stirling Bridge. It contributed to securing English domination over Scotland for the ensuing 300 years and marked a turning point in the First War of Scottish Independence. The fight had a major impact on Scottish identity and culture as well. Celebrated as a symbol of Scottish resistance to English authority, it is considered one of the most significant battles in Scottish history. Edward I, the English monarch, invaded Scotland in 1297. His goal was to crush Scotland and incorporate it into England. This did not sit well with the Scots. They won independence from English domination. They spearheaded an uprising against the British. The leader of the revolution was a Scottish knight named William Wallace. Being a talented fighter, his goal was to set Scotland free. Wallace led the Scottish forces to victory in the Stirling Bridge battle in 1297. It was a significant win for the Scots. It demonstrated the Scots' ability to beat the English. One of the major events of the First War of Scottish Independence was the Battle of Stirling Bridge. The Scottish people were encouraged to carry on their struggle for independence as a result. The width of the bridge where the fight took place was only 12 feet. The Scottish army outnumbered the English force by a ratio of around 2 to 1. By using a clever strategy, the Scottish army managed to trap the English force on the bridge. To generate a powerful current, they constructed a dam upstream. The English soldiers found it challenging to cross the bridge as a result. The English had never lost a significant battle to the Scots until the Battle of Stirling Bridge. Hours pass while the fight rages. At last the English manage to breach the Scottish. Edward wins, and the Scots are destroyed. Edward the Firm fought in several conflicts during his reign. This is just one of them. In addition to being a vicious fighter, he was also an expert strategist. He overthrew Scotland, took control of Wales, and built a powerful central authority in England. An enduring legacy of Edward the Firm's strength and influence can be found in English history. He was a powerful centralizer, an accomplished military leader, and an arts patron. In addition, he was a complex and contentious figure whose rule was characterized by conflict and conquest. Known for having a long, narrow face, Edward went by the moniker the Longshanks. He was an accomplished athlete and horseman. As a fervent supporter of justice, he instituted several tribunals and regulations to safeguard his subjects' rights. In addition, he was a patron of the arts and commissioned several significant pieces of art, such as the Elizabeth crosses, which were built by his late wife Eleanor of Castile. Born on June 17, 1239, Edward the Firm, popularly referred to as the Longshanks, was the son of King Henry III of England and Eleanor of Provence. He had a long, thin face and was tall and lean. In addition, he was a gifted athlete and horseman. There was a lot of disagreement and instability during Edward's early years. His father was a weak and unstable ruler who frequently disagreed with the strong barons. Edward participated in the Second Barons' War and backed his father. Edward succeeded to the throne in 1272 upon his father's passing. Edward was given a demanding education, covering topics such as government and warfare. In addition, he had legal training and was a fervent supporter of justice. Edward started attending school at an early age. Among the group of instructors who educated him was the distinguished scholar and accomplished knight Geoffrey de Lusignan. Edward pursued studies in mathematics, history, Latin, and French. He also gained knowledge of how to use a bow and arrow, a lance, and a sword in battle. As Edward grew older, he studied further. In addition to attending the University of Oxford to study law, he visited France to gain knowledge of the French legal system. From 1272 until 1307, Edward I, popularly referred to as the Longshanks, governed England as a strong and famous king. He was a powerful centralizer, an accomplished military leader, and an arts patron. Edward's success as king was largely dependent on his education and background. He received a rigorous education that included instruction in the legal system, as well as the arts of battle and governance. He was an accomplished athlete and horseman. At the age of 15, Edward traveled to France in 1254 to study in King Louis IX's court. This was standard procedure for young nobles in those days. Edward worked at the French court for 3 years. He gained a lot of knowledge about French politics and culture during this time. He also gained knowledge on how to be an expert diplomat and courtier. The following are some particular lessons Edward picked up while residing at the French court: the value of courtly manners and gallantry, the skill of negotiation and diplomacy, the significance of the rule of law and justice, and the significance of a powerful national government. The French court was known for courtly manners and gallantry. In addition to learning the value of being an excellent fighter, Edward also learned the value of being a gentleman. He gained knowledge on how to conduct himself elegantly, communicate well, and wear nice clothes. Additionally, Edward came to understand the value of diplomacy and negotiation. He gained knowledge on how to establish relations with other rulers and how to settle disputes amicably. Edward fought strongly for justice. He was taught the value of the rule of law and strove to bring forth a just and equitable judicial system in England. Edward came to understand the value of a powerful national government as well. He witnessed the French king's use of his authority to fortify the French monarchy and unite France. His time at the French court had a significant influence on Edward. He acquired the abilities and information required to rule successfully. He also acquired a strong sense of responsibility and fairness. As king, he would benefit greatly from these qualities. There was a lot of strife and instability during Edward's early years. He did, however, have a demanding education and a strong sense of fairness and duty. As king, he would benefit greatly from these attributes. Edward's success as king was largely dependent on his schooling. It provided him with the abilities and know-how required to rule with strength and efficiency. Renowned for his victories and strong determination, Edward I of England had a complicated relationship with his father, King Henry III. This relationship, which was characterized by struggle, loyalty, and finally respect, was very important in determining how Edward would rule as king. Edward was born in 1239 and grew up under his father's stormy rule. Foreign powers and rebellious nobles posed a constant threat to Henry III, who was frequently characterized as being weak and unsure of himself. Edward supported his father throughout the Second Barons' War and accompanied him on expeditions to fight despite the unrest. But Edward's era wasn't all blind allegiance. He was well educated in both politics and warfare. He received instruction in strategy, writing, and fighting from tutors, and he learned the fundamentals of leadership and law from scholars. The future king's blend of military experience and intellectual growth became one of his most distinctive traits. However, as Edward formed friendships with some of his father's competitors, his allegiance was put to the test. He felt that their attempts to change the monarchy were essential since Henry III's indecision was impeding England's development. When Edward supported the rebels against his father at the Battle of Lewes in 1265, it ignited a public war. Edward was aware of the repercussions of unbridled defiance, though. He demonstrated his newly acquired political skills by working with the barons to reach a peaceful resolution after obtaining his father's freedom. He gained the respect of all parties with this diplomatic move, raising the possibility that he would reign in the future. Edward grew more self-reliant, even though he never wavered in his support for his father. In 1270, he set out on a crusade to the Holy Land, where he gained invaluable experience and established his reputation as a formidable fighter. When he returned in 1272, his father was old and sick. Edward took over the role of de facto ruler during the last years of Henry III, running the realm and getting ready for his own coronation. They had disagreed in the past, but now they respect each other. Henry was proud of his son's ability and drive, and Edward understood the difficulties his father had encountered. Edward I became king after Henry I died in 1272. In addition to inheriting a debt-ridden and unstable kingdom, he also carried with him the lessons from his father's rule. Years of loyalty and rivalry with his father had sharpened Edward's firmness and decisiveness, which became the cornerstones of his own effective administration. Edward the Firm and King Henry III had a complicated relationship. It was a tapestry of love, struggle, and, in the end, dignity. Edward learned priceless lessons from this dynamic, which helped him become the strong and well-liked monarch England would later come to know as the Longshanks. King Henry III had a faithful son in Edward I. Even when rebellious nobles and foreign powers challenged Henry III during his reign, he stood by his father. Edward was frequently fought by his father, who was there for him both materially and emotionally. Potential is the capacity to grow or transform. It can be a source of hope and optimism, and it is frequently viewed as a positive attribute. The son's capacity for development and learning serves as evidence of the potential in a father-son relationship. It is also evident in the son's remarkable accomplishments. Edward the Firm was a son full of promise. He had talent, intelligence, and ambition. In addition, he was an innate leader and a formidable fighter. King Henry III, the father of Edward, saw his son's promise. He gave Edward a hard education in both politics and warfare,
Additionally, he provided Edward with chances to demonstrate his abilities, such as by letting him command military operations. Edward's potential and loyalty made him a successful king. He overthrew Scotland, Wales, and England, establishing a powerful central administration. He is regarded as one of the greatest rulers in English history in terms of strength and influence. Two significant attributes that are present in a father-son relationship are potential and loyalty. For both the father and the boy, they can be a source of courage, hope, and strength. Edward and his father, King Henry III, were quite close. He fought in the Second Barons' War to defend his father's reign and was a devoted and helpful son. Edward was a capable politician as well. He succeeded in forging ties with the wealthy lords and bolstering the monarchy's authority.
From 1272 to 1307, Edward the Farter, sometimes known as the Longshanks due to his massive size, ruled England. However, in order to comprehend this formidable monarch, we must go back in time to his early years, a crucible formed under the stormy reign of his father, King Henry III. Edward, who was born in 1239, saw his father's hardships firsthand. Foreign powers and rebellious nobles caused ongoing turbulence for Henry III, who was frequently portrayed as weak and unsure of himself. Nevertheless, Edward continued to be a steadfast ally, participating in the Second Barons' War with his father. Loyalty was not blind, though. After seeing his father's failings, Edward realized that reform was necessary and occasionally sided with the rebels, demonstrating his developing political savvy. This crucible produced Edward's distinctive combination of features. Through fighting, he developed into a brilliant warrior, but he also became a cunning politician who understood how to negotiate the perilous waters of power. Despite his intense loyalty, he recognized the value of power and decisiveness, lessons that would serve as the pillars of his own rule. As Henry III became older, Edward assumed more and more responsibility. He set out on a bold crusade and returned a more experienced warrior with a more sophisticated demeanor and a more profound grasp of administration. By the time Henry III passed away in 1272, Edward had not only become a son but also a seasoned statesman who was anxious to pave his own course. Foreign involvement, rebellions, and bankruptcy plagued Henry III's rule. Equipped with the knowledge gained from his father's mistakes, Edward took these obstacles head-on. He consolidated the monarchy, subdued the barons' influence, and launched bold operations to take control of Scotland and Wales. Despite the brutality of his conquests, Edward saw the importance of uniting these regions under a powerful central authority. He created laws and courts, establishing the foundation for a more affluent and unified England. These accomplishments demonstrated that Edward had taken note of both his father's advantages and disadvantages, and they stood in sharp contrast to his father's rule. The impact of Edward the Fair goes well beyond his military victories. He promoted trade and commerce, developed a strong judicial system, and supported the arts. He was a complicated character who was respected for his unshakable devotion to his country, despite being notorious for his brutality. However, his childhood's crucible was the key to his accomplishment. His upbringing during his father's hardships had given him a profound appreciation of the difficulties and obligations that came with holding the throne. After reflecting on his father's errors and developing his own strengths, he became a strong monarch who changed the course of England's history in ways his father could never have imagined. The Longshanks, Edward the Fair, is a colossal figure who marches across history. He united England, conquered new lands, and left a legacy of economic expansion and legislative changes. But brutality and bloodshed also marred his reign. We must examine all facets of this multifaceted monarch in order to comprehend Edward, realizing how the shadow of his father mounted him into a man of law and iron. Edward was born in 1239 and saw his father, King Henry III, struggle with foreign intrigue and rebellious barons. Edward's heart was a beacon of loyalty. He engaged in combat with his father, the blood of battle strengthening his resolve. Edward, though, was more than just a devoted son. He observed the weaknesses that led to anarchy and the fissures in his father's rule. Edward improved his own diplomatic and leadership abilities by taking note of these shortcomings. Edward came into a divided and indebted nation when he took the throne in 1272. He moved quickly and decisively. He brutally subjugated Scotland, receiving the nickname Hammer of the Scots for his use of an iron hand to put down rebellions. But Edward continued to build even as his men trampled the land. By establishing the model parliament, he gave the commons a voice and created a legal framework that went beyond personal preferences. His legislative initiatives, including the Westminster and Merchant Statutes, facilitated trade, safeguarded property rights, and laid the groundwork for a society that was more equitable. Edward saw that justice was just as important to a stable realm as terror. He promoted trade and development throughout England in order to stimulate economic progress. Towns prospered, trade grew, and England's coffers grew during his rule. Still, the memory of his father's mistakes hung over him. Edward's unwavering desire drove him to fight battles that depleted his wealth. Conquest came at a great cost, in terms of human lives as well as the growing unrest within his own boundaries. Once cowed, the English nobles started to rebel against the crown's tightening hold. The man himself was as complex as Edward's legacy. He was a warrior king who was brutal in his quest for power, but also a reformer who laid the foundation for an England that was affluent and just. By conquest, he brought the country together, but he also planted the seeds for future strife. In order to see Edward completely, we must view him as a product of his times and his father's rule, rather than as a perfect example of virtue or evil. He forged his own path with vision and ruthlessness, taking lessons from both his father's strengths and shortcomings. His conquests and laws have left behind a kingdom that is both fortified and battered, reflecting the complicated man who held the throne. Edward I, upon his coronation in 1272. Back then, England was not so much a joyful monarchy as it was a group of quarreling relatives, battling over the family toys. Consider England as a large farm, with the king serving as the head farmer. However, all of the lesser farmers, or barons, were fighting over who should milk the cows, who should receive the best fields, and even how many eggs the hens should lay, rather than cooperating to produce livestock and grow crops. It was disorganized. Edward then appears, standing 6 feet tall and with legs so lengthy that he was given the moniker Longshanks. Like a newly hired head farmer, he observed the mess and exclaimed, "Enough is enough." He would not allow England to come apart like a mismatched jigsaw. He began by resolving the primary issue, which was the quarreling cousins. He could be tough without fear, like a lion calming down rambunctious kittens. He put an end to any uprisings like grapes to juice, and soon all were aware of who was in charge. Edward, though, was more than simply a bully. He was intelligent. He was aware that England would not become powerful under a one-man rule. Therefore, he offered the kittens some guidelines to play by rather than yelling at them. He established a committee known as the Model Parliament, wherein smaller farmers could express their issues and participate in decision-making. In addition, he codified these regulations into large, easily readable documents known as laws, which served as a guide for everybody. However, things weren't all sunshine and rainbows. Just like youngsters might complain about needing to wash their hands before supper, some farmers complained about all the new regulations. However, things began to shift gradually. England was beginning to feel like a real squad, not simply a group of quarreling farmers. Although Edward still needed to let out his lion roar on occasion, things were generally improving. The land was fertile, the quarreling farmers were cooperating, and England was becoming more powerful every day. That is the tale of Edward I, the ruler who took over a broken and fragmented country and gradually transformed it into a magnificent and cohesive entity. It wasn't known that Edward I, the Longshanks, played patty cake. His use of his crown as a battle hammer against rebels earned him the terrifying moniker Hammer of the Scots. However, His brutal conquest of Scotland was more than just a grab for power. It was a convoluted story of ambition, treachery, and a conflict of wills. Consider Scotland and England as quarreling siblings who were always arguing about everything from bridges to borders. They had been tossing rocks and stealing toys for generations, which included castles and land. But Edward saw an opportunity to put a permanent stop to the conflict when Scotland named John Balliol king in 1292. With an army as ruthless as his rage, he proclaimed, "My throne, my rules," and marched north. A vicious ballet of steel and screaming was the Battle of Berwick in 1296. Edward's army smashed the Scots like a battering ram against a gate, leaving Balliol a wailing prisoner and Berwick a bleeding ruin. However, Scotland would not be as readily subdued as a wild stag. From the Highlands came William Wallace, a granite-faced Scotsman full of fire. With the roar of a lion, he led his fellow Scots with the slyness of a fox. In 1297, Wallace, dubbed Braveheart for his steadfast bravery, threw Edward for a loop during the Battle of Stirling Bridge. It resembled a stubborn stone hurled up against a fortress wall. The following year, a furious and humiliated Edward made a triumphant return. The earth shook at the clash of steel during the Battle of Falkirk in 1298. It was a battle of titans. Despite being outnumbered and deceived, Wallace battled valiantly, but in the end, Edward's unbeatable armies won. Scotland was far from over. Another fearsome figure emerged from the shadows, Robert the Bruce. He was waiting for the ideal opportunity to attack with the patience of a spider. At the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, Bruce's smaller army took advantage of the rugged Scottish terrain and shrewd tactics. The English were sent reeling south as they shot through Edward's forces like arrows through leather. Edward never fully subjugated Scotland. His hammer had met its counterpart in the Scots' unwavering spirit. However, his initiatives had a significant influence that shaped both countries' futures and borders. The Longshanks, often known as Edward the First, were a complicated man who had a profound effect on England. Although he is best known for his economic expansion and legislative reforms, his reign was also characterized by brutal conquest and the suppression of uprisings. Both human lives lost and baronial animosity were high costs of this. Conquest and warfare. Edward's ambition drove him to fight in multiple conflicts, especially against Wales and Scotland. Numerous people died in these fights on both sides, shattering families and decimating towns. Thousands of people lost their lives in particularly horrific battles like Bannockburn and Falkirk. Growing discontent. The aristocracy bore a severe burden as a result of Edward's unrelenting conquering efforts, which depleted the kingdom's resources. This, together with his disdain for baronial worries, increased resentment and a desire to limit his authority. The seeds of future conflict. Tensions like the Wars of the Roses in the 15th century were sparked by the anger sown throughout Edward's reign. The power struggles and unhappiness that Edward's policies encouraged were contributing factors in these disputes. It's critical to keep in mind the diversity of Edward's legacy. Even though he made great progress, his tactics were very expensive. Important parts of his reign that should not be disregarded are the lives lost and the baronial wrath he incited. We are able to obtain a fuller grasp of this multifaceted and powerful monarch by comprehending these darker sides. In conclusion, there was both progress and violence during Edward I's reign. Numerous lives were lost in his vicious drive of conquest and power consolidation, which also inflamed animosity among the English elite. These significant facets of his legacy help us comprehend the man and his significance in English history on a deeper level. Edward I, the Longshanks, was more than just a battle-axe monarch, despite his reputation for being a nasty guy. In addition, he was a cunning businessman who understood how to enrich and enliven England. Imagine him as a massive money magnet who attracts cash and disperses it like seeds. Trade highways. By constructing better roads and bridges, he made it simpler for traders to go around and sell their wares. Imagine them as modern, opulent malls from the Middle Ages, open for business. He invited merchants from all over the world and established thriving marketplaces where people could bargain for spices, silks, and occasionally even unicorn horns, which are probably fake, but hey, clever marketing. Coin flip. He ensured that everyone had brand new, sparkling coins to jingle in their pockets, which made purchasing and selling goods simpler. I will no longer barter with cows and hens. Farming frenzy. By pushing farmers to produce more food and rear more livestock, he transformed England into a massive store, well, minus the neon lights. King Edward I, the Longshanks, had a significant impact on England in both positive and negative ways. He established elegant courts and strict rules, but his reign was not without a price: unhappy nobility and the taking of human lives. Edward enjoyed conquest, which involved fighting and, regrettably, a great deal of casualties or worse. Wales and Scotland felt his sword most acutely. Things could get nasty if you cross Edward. Public executions and torture weren't exactly his best bedside manners. Not everyone was a fan of Edward's methods. Some people retaliated, and guess what? More fatalities. Edward did not want to share power with the nobility as previously. He wanted all of England to himself. They felt like disgruntled kittens that had misplaced their bowl of milk as a result. Building was Edward's passion, but it required a lot of money, especially from the nobility. Not precisely a formula for content expressions. When it came to the concerns of the nobility, Edward was not the finest listener. It's annoying, similar to talking to a stone wall. Therefore, even though Edward accomplished some positive things, his rule unfortunately came with a high cost. Many unhappy barons and the loss of lives. To obtain a realistic image of the past, it is crucial to keep in mind both the positive and negative aspects of history. The ashes of his father's rule and the fire of his own ambition formed Edward I as a monarch. He developed an understanding of both what to construct and what to avoid, leaving a legacy as nuanced and paradoxical as the man himself. A complicated and contentious man, Edward I, often known as the Longshanks, had a profound effect on England. Both progress and violence were hallmarks of his tenure, and his legacy is still up for debate. Economic expansion. England's economy expanded during Edward's rule. In order to enhance transportation, he constructed roads and bridges and promoted trade and business. A more rich and cohesive monarchy resulted from this. Edward also implemented significant legal improvements. A forerunner to the current British Parliament, he founded the Model Parliament. Additionally, he enacted legislation that expedited trade and safeguarded property rights. These changes contributed to the development of a more equitable society and strengthened the rule of law. National identity. Edward contributed to the development of the national identity of England. He established castles and other structures all across the realm after subduing Scotland and Wales. This promoted a sense of pride in the country and served to unite England. Warfare and conquest. Edward's conquest of Scotland and Wales was expensive and brutal. Additionally, he engaged in multiple conflicts with France, depleting England's resources. Human rights violations. Edward had a reputation for treating people harshly when they disobeyed him. He employed public executions and torture, which instilled a generalized sense of fear and animosity. Baronial resentment. Edward's concentration of power and increases in taxes offended many English nobles. They were unhappy and plotting a smoldering insurrection because they believed their customary rights and privileges were being undermined. Edward I left behind a complicated and varied legacy. He was a cruel conqueror who violated human rights, but he was also a powerful and determined leader who made a tremendous contribution to England. His reign had a long-lasting effect on English history, and his legacy is still up for discussion. Edward I was a contentious person who left behind a complicated legacy. Both progress and violence characterized his rule, and his influence on England is still up for dispute. To obtain a complete image of this significant man in English history, it is crucial to keep in mind both the positive and negative aspects of his reign. England's economy expanded throughout Edward's reign. In order to enhance transportation, he constructed roads and bridges and promoted trade and business. A more rich and cohesive monarchy resulted from this. Edward changed the law significantly as well. A forerunner to the current British Parliament, he founded the Model Parliament. Additionally, he enacted legislation that expedited trade and safeguarded property rights. These changes contributed to the development of a more equitable society and strengthened the rule of law. Edward contributed to the development of the national identity of England. He established castles and other structures all across the realm after subduing Scotland and Wales. This promoted a sense of pride in the country and served to unite England. Warfare and conquest. Edward's conquest of Scotland and Wales was expensive and brutal. Additionally, he engaged in multiple conflicts with France, depleting England's resources. Violations of human rights. Edward was renowned for treating anyone harshly who disobeyed him. He employed public executions and torture, which instilled a generalized sense of fear and animosity. Baronial resentment. Edward's concentration of power and increases in taxes offended many English nobles. They were unhappy and plotting a smoldering insurrection because they believed their customary rights and privileges were being undermined. Edward thus left behind a complicated and varied legacy. He was a cruel conqueror who violated human rights, but he was also a powerful and determined leader who made a tremendous contribution to England. His reign had a long-lasting effect on English history, and his legacy is still up for discussion. The legacy of Edward the Firm is fascinating for several reasons. It is a story of both growth and carnage, to start. During Edward's reign, there was legislative reform, economic expansion, and human rights violations, but there was also conquest and conflict. Edward the Firm is a fascinating and interesting character because of this difference. Second, the legacy of Edward the Firm remains important today. His legal reforms laid the groundwork for the British legal system, and his conquest of Wales and Scotland contributed to the formation of the United Kingdom's current borders. His legacy offers insights into the nuanced nature of power and authority, and is still a topic of controversy and discussion today. The legal system. Edward III's legal reforms have strengthened England's legal system. In addition to establishing the Model Parliament, which aided in increasing public accountability for the government, he also implemented laws safeguarding property rights and streamlining commerce. These reforms made it possible for both a more stable government and a more equitable society. Identity of the nation. Edward the Firm's conquest of Wales and Scotland significantly shaped the boundaries of the United Kingdom as it is today. His influence lives on in the cultures and identities of Wales and Scotland. He brought these two nations together under English authority. The legacy of Edward the First is intricate and varied, but it is also one that has lasting significance. While there was carnage and progress during his reign, many of the institutions and principles that the United Kingdom holds dear today were established. With all his might and drive, Edward saw his father, King Henry III, stumble around the throne like a hot potato. Barons complained like famished animals, rebellions sprung up like weeds, and England felt unsteady as a precarious bridge. This was hardly the kingdom that Edward had imagined. By the time Edward took the throne for himself, he was prepared to transform England from a rundown hut into a powerful fortress. A peek into his political career is provided here. Edward, the Hammer of the Scots, disliked giving anything away, especially his property. With his blade gleaming like a flash of lightning, he marched north and overran Wallace. All through Scotland vigorously retaliated, leaving muddy battles and sour memories. Edward ultimately succeeded in claiming a sizable portion of their territory. Builder of laws. Edward was aware that sturdy castles required sturdy walls. He constructed his own strong, equitable laws. He established the Model Parliament, a formal term for a council of important folks, in which all members may express their grievances. To ensure that no one could claim ignorance of the laws, he also penned them down in large books. Taxman cometh. It's not cheap to build castles. Edward was in need of money, and he was able to obtain it from both farmers and nobility. Some complained and nicknamed him Longshanks, in jest because of his height, but Edward remained unmoved. He did not need a rusty empire, but one well-oiled. Foreign enemies. Edward was a knight in addition to being a castle warden. To get into a fight with France, he crossed the sea, but the battle went on forever, like a mushy stew. It depleted England's resources and made everyone, even Edward, ill. A legacy forged in iron. England had changed by the time Edward's reign came to an end. It had beautiful new laws and was stronger and greater, but it also bore the wounds of war and the resentment of pockets drained by taxation. Like his fortress, Edward's legacy was constructed of iron and mortar, and he was known for both his hard choices and his victories. A complicated and contentious man, Edward I, often known as the Longshanks, had a profound effect on England. Both progress and violence were hallmarks of his tenure, and his legacy is still up for debate. The connection between Edward I and democracy is among the most intriguing elements of his legacy. He was, on the one hand, a powerful and decisive leader who frequently took decisions without seeking input from the populace. However, he also carried out important reforms that contributed to the development of a more just society and the reinforcement of the rule of law. Edward I's creation of the model parliament in 1295 was his greatest contribution to democracy. For the first time, members from all around England were called to Parliament during the Model Parliament, which served as a model for the current British Parliament. This was a significant step towards a more representative form of governance and contributed to the establishment of England's democracy. A variety of additional reforms implemented by Edward I also contributed to the upholding of the statute. In addition to creating a more open court system, he also passed laws safeguarding property rights and facilitating trade. These reforms made it possible for both a more stable government and a more equitable society. In spite of his democratic accomplishments, Edward I was a terrible explorer who violated human rights. He utilized torture and public executions to hold on to power after using force to capture Wales and Scotland. These acts created a great deal of dread and animosity and went directly against democratic ideals. Edward I left behind a complicated and varied legacy. He was a cruel conqueror who violated human rights, but he was also a powerful and determined leader who made a tremendous contribution to England. His reign had a long-lasting effect on English history, and his legacy is still up for discussion. The legacy of Edward I is interesting for several reasons. It is a story of both growth and violence. To start, Edward III created the Model Parliament in 1295, which served as a model for the current British Parliament. It helped establish the groundwork for a more representative government, since it was the first time that delegates from across England had been called to Parliament. His influence lives on in the cultures and identities of Wales and Scotland. He brought these two nations together under English authority. Edward required large amounts of money to construct his magnificent castles and finance his wars. He extracted taxes from all parties involved, removing any notion of equity. This anger toward the King of England sowed seeds of discontent rather than democracy. Edward could not settle for only England. As he advanced north, he overran portions of Scotland and Wales. Although this strengthened his position, it also entailed putting his will on other people, which is very different from the consent and representation ideals that are the foundation of democracy. What is Edward's current standing? Was he the greatest enemy of democracy or one of its defenders? In actuality, he was a multifaceted character who sowed both thorns and seeds. Although Edward was not a model democrat, his reign was an important step in England's transition to a more representational form of government. We may take a lesson from his successes as well as his failures, realizing that democracy is a delicate flower that requires care and sunlight to fully bloom. Through the perspective of democracy, we may better comprehend how this priceless system developed, the difficulties it encountered, and the ongoing battle to strike a balance between advancement and power during Edward I's reign. Recall that history is the continuous narrative of how we create the society in which we live, not just the tale of rulers and wars. On July 7, 1307, Edward III, the Longshanks, passed away at the age of 67. He got sick and passed away while traveling to Scotland to engage in a battle. Although there are a few ideas, it is uncertain what specifically caused Edward to die. One idea holds that he passed away for natural reasons, like a stroke or heart attack, legal reform, and unification. Debates about his legacy are still going strong today. Buried in Westminster Abbey in London, England, was Edward I, also known as the Longshanks, of organic causes including a stroke or heart attack, legal reform, and unification. Arguments about his legacy are still going strong today. Buried in Westminster Abbey in London, England, was Edward I, also known as the Longshanks. His grave, a stunning and powerful monument, is still standing today. It is adorned with gold statues of saints and angels and is constructed of black marble. Additionally, there is an effigy of Edward reclining in state and donning his coronation robes made of gilded bronze. For centuries, English monarchs have been crowned at Westminster Abbey, a renowned church. It's a sort of royal graveyard because many other kings and queens have been buried there as well. Hence, even though Edward I didn't quite achieve his goal of conquering all of Scotland, his final resting site continues to serve as a potent reminder of his role and influence in England. England suffered a great loss with Edward's passing. He was a well-liked monarch, and the country experienced instability after his passing. Establishing a successful country, England prospered under his rule thanks to growing trade, better infrastructure, and the emergence of new industries that gave the populace more power. Although his brutal conquest of Wales and portions of Scotland strengthened his hold, it also threatened the fundamental consent concept that is the foundation of genuine democracy. Edward extorted money from everyone to finance his goals, which hampered personal autonomy and fostered enmity towards the monarchy. Conqueror, not unifier, his use of force to quell opposition and restrict free expression overshadowed his other achievements. A complicated tapestry woven with both seeds and thorns was Edward I's reign. Although he wasn't a model democrat, his tale illustrates the continuous battle to strike a balance between advancement and power in the pursuit of fully representative governance. Recall that history is about more than just monarchs and wars. It's also about how societies change over time, and Edward I's reign serves as a potent reminder of the fine line that must be drawn between power and progress. Though not a modern democracy, the model parliament highlights the continuous battle to strike a balance between the voices of the people and the authority of leaders. In democratic elections and conversations about government accountability, we still argue over this. Resentment was aroused by Edward's high taxes, which served as a reminder of the fine line that must be drawn between meeting public demands and preserving personal financial autonomy. Discussions concerning social welfare programs and tax rates are part of this ongoing debate. Cultural identity and conquest. Edward's conquest of Scotland and Wales presents issues of national identity and self-determination that are pertinent to current aspirations for autonomy or independence in a number of different parts of the world. Constructing just legal frameworks. Edward's legal reforms laid the groundwork for fair and accessible courts, a value we cherish in modern legal systems. We continue to work towards ensuring equal protection under the law and improving access to justice. Human rights and authority. Edward's severe penalties and repression of criticism show how crucial it is to defend human rights, even against strong authorities. This speaks to the current struggles against individual freedom, abuses, and authoritarian regimes. The legacy of nuanced individuals. Edward's dual legacy serves as a reminder that historical leaders were occasionally both innovators and oppressors, demanding a careful examination of their deeds and an appreciation of their complex effects. Studying Edward's reign can teach us important lessons about the prospects and difficulties of creating an equitable and successful society, as well as about leadership and government in the modern era. The continuous transformation of society. Edward's narrative serves as an example of how political structures and social norms are always changing, serving as a reminder that progress frequently entails both embracing and rejecting the past. Both progress and violence were hallmarks of his tenure, and his legacy is still up for debate. Edward's achievements are interesting, but his brutality also casts a shadow over them. In order to further his ambitions of expanding English power, this strong and resolute leader was not above resorting to violence and oppression. The memory of Edward serves as a warning that history is not always clear-cut. Even the most progressive initiatives can backfire, and even the most accomplished leaders can have dark sides. An individual of his era, Edward I. He was a product of his surroundings and upbringing, and the possibilities and difficulties of his time molded him. Edward I was a progressive leader in many respects. Edward I was a merciless conquistador nonetheless. In the process of subduing Wales and Scotland, he alienated a large number of his own subjects by using violence and oppression. There are many aspects to Edward I's legacy. He was a man of enormous achievements as well as enormous shortcomings. His narrative serves as a reminder that history is not always clear-cut, and that even the most powerful people can have flaws. In addition to working to better the lives of those who succeeded him, he was an outspoken advocate of the rule of law.